The whip hung in the sunlight like a question. For a moment it was only a dark curve against dust and heat, suspended between a forearm and a body, the leather trembling with the promise of impact. In the yard of the Mendonça estate, where the scrub pines cast long, sleepy shadows across the packed earth, the sight of the whip halted more than a punishment. It arrested the very logic that had kept the place in motion for a generation: command, obedience, and the quiet assumption that pain kept order. Rodrigo Mendonça de Almeida moved without haste. He had become accustomed to people moving for him, to the subtle choreography of a household built on authority. Yet now, watching the whip stop mid-arc because of his voice, he felt something older than authority stir. An authority that was not only his by title, but supposed to be moral as well. He said one word. The fighter's hand stilled, the leather drooped. The man on the ground, old stooped skin like tree bark, cawed softly and rose, rubbing the place where the lash had almost met him. His name was Benedito. He did not look up. The courtyard smelled of sun-bleached wood and boiling metal, of sweat and the faint persistent residue of coffee. That coffee carried another scent he had learned to expect in the mornings at the table. Clove. A single clove bobbed in the cup, a round dark island in the brown tide. It was a small stubborn trace of an older household practice, a spice threaded into the domestic rituals of Serra Fria. Rodrigo had tasted it his whole life, and never thought about how it had been placed there or by whom. He had never wondered which hands folded the cloth napkins or bent the brittle tea leaves into a pot for the child who had refused to sleep. He had seen that foreman Arnaldo many times before. Tall, lean, with the cautious stare of a man, long unaccountable to anything but his own appetite. Arnaldo's role was to keep the wheels turning, to translate Rodrigo's commands into the labor that worked the land. He was also the one who made sure the house's rules were enforced. No idle talk, no stepping out of line, and above all, that the appearances of order were preserved. When a lash was about to fall and the Baron said stop, Arnaldo's face betrayed a small private outrage. It was the outrage of a man who had been curbed in a country where his control over others had been the only law he recognized. Rodrigo watched him, and watched Candida. She stood with her palms folded beneath her apron, shoulders squared as if weight had taught her how to stand. She was the oldest among the houseworkers, her hair threaded with grey, but there was a sturdiness to her that had nothing to do with youth. Her hands were those of someone who had fed and soothed and mended. They were the hands that had held a boot for mending and cupped a child's cheek at night. She did not flinch when the whip hovered. She had been watching Rodrigo almost as if what happened around him were an education she had chosen to give. Her face wore a patient clarity, not pleading, not saintly. It was the face of someone who had learned to protect herself by being indispensable. Silence gathered like a curtain. The courtyard's routine resumed, with people shifting, a mule lowing in the shade, a dog skirting toward the kitchen. But the moment had been broken. A ripple of talk would spread soon enough, the day the Baron stopped the punishment. It was remarkable partly because it was rare. It was remarkable because Rodrigo had spoken. He left the yard before questions could congeal. The house had an office that smelled primarily of paper and lemon oil. Rodrigo's desk, large with notches worn into its edges, sat near the window that looked out over the plantation's lower path. He set himself with the deliberate slowness of a man collecting a mood. The envelope that would change the day's geometry lay where someone had left it, plain, edges frayed, the handwriting small and firm. No name in the upper left, no seal, just a folded sheet pressed within. He opened it, and the paper held the weight of a person who had learned to make words do only what they must. The note was spare, the sentences short enough to be measured with the breath. It said that the writer remembered a day with lantern light and a cry, that she had been the one who had put a child to her breast, that she had kept watch and had been bought and sold and bought again, and that she had been told to stay silent. The name at the end, Candida. Rodrigo read it twice because it felt like something from a different language, a bench of memory suddenly upended. His first thought was of his mother, Henriqueta, gone these many years. He had been told she had died while he was still small, and the house had folded itself around that story until it became the only story that mattered. Then memory, slippered and uncertain, entered through the smell of clove. He tasted it, wanting to identify where it had come from. And the cup of his childhood rose. A woman's breath at night, the warmth of someone who had pressed a cloth to his forehead, the faint medicinal bitterness of a tea meant to make a child sleep. If a scent could be a wound, the clove was it, small, precise, a thing that opened the door to rooms he had thought closed. He kept the paper folded on the desk, folded like a mouth closing. He thought of his father, Eduardo, a man who had carved the estate out of land and debt, and had tried to set a household's rules with the stubborn belief that control was providence. The record of that father was a ledger and a stern face. The note suggested another side to that ledger. Purchases not only of land and cattle, but of human lives meant for the household. The note suggested that someone had been purchased to nurse him, to be close to his infancy in a way his father could not be. Rodrigo's first move was not to storm the kitchen. He could have. He could have called for Candida immediately, for the household favored drama at times, and forced some thunderous recognition. But the note had a calmness that resisted spectacle. It proposed a truth rather than demanded a performance. He folded it into his pocket and went to find Benedito. Benedito sat by the back of the house beneath a fig tree, hands in his lap, watching the sun slip along the courtyard wall as if it were a clock in a language he had learned. He was older than most claims of age permitted, and he carried memory like a shawl. People sought him when they could not find the past by themselves. Rodrigo approached with measured patience. He had learned that some pasts required invitation rather than seizure. "Benedito," Rodrigo said. The elder turned his head, and the slow smile that grazed his mouth was not for flattery. It was recognition, the kind of recognition that thinned the air with gravity. Rodrigo had in his pocket the folded paper and the sudden knowledge that the household held more than it had ever told him. "Baron," Benedito said simply. The title in his mouth was an old muscle, exercised through years of courtesy and caution. He did not rush to bend. He was a keeper of facts and of time's weather. "You look at me as though you were on a road you had not walked before." Rodrigo sat. "I found a letter." Benedito's fingers tightened once around the cane he held. "From whom?" Rodrigo named the name, and the elder's face did not change much, but his eyes narrowed with the patience of one who had been waiting for recognition. "She came to this house the first season the lands were cleared," Benedito said. "She was brought to be a nurse. Your father, he could not hold the sight of infant cries. He did not trust their weakness. He paid so the child would be quiet in the night and not trouble the house." Rodrigo listened. The facts, when placed in this spare manner, sounded different from the stories told at table, the ones that exhaled into jokes and old grievances. These facts were small stones that made the big road uneven. "She was not merely a helper," Benedito added. "She fed, she watched. She slept with the child's face on her breast when the fever came. She watched the way you grew. Then your father, he had reasons. He sold her away to a neighbor when debts tightened. He bought her back some seasons later, but he told her to be quiet, not to make claims, not to tell that she had been close. He said the boy must be raised like other boys of our name." Rodrigo pictured his father framed by ledger light, making decisions the way a man pruned a tree, cutting away what he assumed unnecessary. The ledger did not record tenderness, only costs. Benedito went on, steady as a clock. "She came back," he said. "She came back and did as she was told. Stayed in the house, watched. She did not pretend otherwise. That is her doing. She chose to remain." There it was, the important thing Benedito offered. Not passivity, but decision. Candida had stayed. The thing that made endurance indistinguishable from submission is the attention to motive. Benedito's certainty was not speculation. He had witnessed the transactions, heard the words in the back rooms where men kept their business. He had seen Candida at the fireside, such that her presence was a constant in the domestic architecture of their lives. Rodrigo felt the ground of his certainty shift. Memory arrived in small, prickling ways. He saw Candida once, years ago, cradling an infant in kitchen light. He remembered the way his father's face had hardened when the child would cry. He remembered not the child's small kindness but the adult calculations that had followed. He had never asked. That omission now felt like a thing that could be counted. He asked Benedito then what he already knew he wanted. Why would she write to him now? Why put a trembling signature at the end of a note that could ruin or redeem in the quiet way that notes do? Benedito took his time. Perhaps she was tired of the silence, he said. Perhaps she thought you might have ears. Perhaps she wanted to be seen before she left. This house makes the past an appliance. People live as though the past can be put in the drawer. She did not think so. Rodrigo left Benedito near the fig tree and walked through the house as if learning the layout for the first time. The kitchens were aromatic with the pressing heat of midday. Pots clinked. The women who worked there moved with hands seasoned by years. Among them, Candida stood by the hearth, turning a stick in the stew. There was no sudden convulsion of the room at his approach. The kitchen performed its own slow rituals of survival and service. He did not stride forward as a man whose title gave him claim to truth. He approached with something like a careful apology for intrusion. "Candida," he said. She turned, and for a fraction of a breath, he saw the steadiness that had become her posture. Her voice when she spoke was low, precise. She did not startle. She had been expecting, perhaps, that he might one day ask. "Sayu sent a letter," he said. He could not make the paper go away. He had it folded in his palm like a small living thing. Candida looked at the paper, and then at him. "Yes," she said, "I wrote what was true." He felt the hopelessness of not knowing how to ask the right questions. He asked the simplest, "Why now?" Her hands did not tremble. "Because the years are counting me," she said, "because there is a thing a body holds that is not for itself. I thought to give you the truth while I am here to see it given." Rodrigo found himself unmoored by the plainness of that sentence. The house had been full of people like her, people who preferred a quiet economy of truth. He wanted to say something large and theatrical, call for confessions, apologies, any sort of public rite of recognition, but the note had itself asked for no spectacle. He set the paper on the table between them and watched it sit like a small, clear thing. Candida spoke then in a way that refused pathos. Her speech was factual, the way a person who has stewarded many painful facts is apt to speak. "I was bought to be a wet nurse. I nursed you until you could take milk another way. Then I was sold away. Later, I was returned. Not because of mercy, but because the house needed a woman who knew the child. Your father paid to have me back, and he told me to keep my tongue. He told me to watch. He told me to be useful." Rodrigo listened and felt something else besides surprise, a slow assembling of obligations he had never acknowledged. To be shown the ledger line that had accounted for a woman's labor as an item to be added and reduced made his own lineage look tawdry. He thought of the society around, neighbors who measured honor in public acknowledgments and in the quiet obedience of those they owned. He also thought, with an unwelcome clarity, of his father's face when he had been told a man's debts were paid. The father had believed in expiation that did not require speech. Candida continued, but she did not linger in the bitterness that might be expected. Anger would have been honest, but it was not the shape she chose. Instead, she spoke of practicalities, of nights she had watched over him when his fever came, of the small ways she had smoothed his life, the boiled teas, the cloths to cool the brow, the lullabies without melody. She spoke of being sold and returned, of the indignities not as drama but as ledger entries, bought for a sum, then sold for another, returned as if she were a tool. "And you?" she asked after a moment. "Do you understand that I was there for you?" She did not use the baronial title. She used his name, Rodrigo, not the name of rank. That small intimacy struck him more than any public avowal could have. He felt the oddness of being addressed on equal terms by a woman who had been told to keep silent. He felt his own childhood like something he had been in but not of. For the first time, the shelter his title provided felt thin as paper. Their talk was not theatrical. It did not demand a crowd. It was a private reckoning in a kitchen that smelled of stewing beans and clove, where the spice seemed to lay itself like a thin film over conversation. Candida's words landed like stones in water, inevitable, rippling, not designed to drown but to alter the flow. During the exchange, the yard's rhythm did not halt. Arnaldo passed the door and paused as if to overhear. He leaned on his cane and kept his face impassive. Arnaldo had ears in places where others did not suspect. He had learned how to make knowledge into income. Perhaps he had been listening all his life because it had been profitable. When he perceived an entrance that could be leveraged, a secret that might make him richer or safer, his face turned applicably blank and then wary. His eyes caught the folded piece of paper on the table and narrowed. Rodrigo finished speaking with Candida and left the kitchen. He needed an answer to more than the personal history. He needed to understand what revealing such a thing could mean in a town where reputations were currency and where a word could burn an estate's credit in a market of gossip. He walked back toward the office, and when he passed Arnaldo near the stair, the foreman slanted toward him. "Baron," Arnaldo said, voice neutral, "there are things you ought to know. A man who keeps things may want to make them into something else. People will talk." Rodrigo felt the warning like a chill. "What do you mean?" Arnaldo's expression folded into something patient. He was practiced in the small manners of menace. "There are coffee sacks missing," he said. "Little things. A woman is making claims. She could cause trouble if someone chose to feed her indignation with coin. Those who want to keep the estates calm may help by a little discretion." Rodrigo looked at him for a long moment. The foreman did not sound like a thief confessing to theft. He sounded like a man making a proposal, one that had been tried in various houses and offices where convenience outweighed conscience. Rodrigo thought about the sums that might be asked, about the quietness of a payoff that would keep everything exactly as it had been, a neat preservation of the ledger's peace. He refused the first impulse to call for an immediate accounting, as if all sins could be tallied by a pen. Instead, he collected facts. The coffee stored in the plantation's cellar was known to be a source of small recurring diversions. Men sold it to pass the time, or used sacks as secret money to feed visits to the towns outside the estate. He had not noticed until now how unmoored his stewardship had been from scrutiny. He had been willing, as many men were, to trust the routine. Yet Arnaldo's words contained a second sting. He had not merely proffered a payoff, he had suggested a price to keep people quiet about Candida's letter. He had hinted that the letter could be made into something worse for the estate, and that he, Arnaldo, could keep it from becoming so for the right consideration. That was thinly veiled extortion. "Evidence?" Rodrigo asked finally. He did not intend to hand the situation to rumor. His voice was quieter than the baronial tone, but had a different sharpness, the sharpness of someone about to reclaim command. Arnaldo smiled without warmth. "A ledger, perhaps, signed by a neighbor, a handful of sacks. People will remember seeing them on the road. Or they will not. It depends on what's paid." Rodrigo felt the cheapness of the proposal as if it were a slap. It would have been easier, perhaps, to pay and smooth the matter, like the land being raked flat. But the letter in his pocket had altered things. It had put into motion a truth that could not be simply folded back into the ledger. Candida's name had a gravity now. Turning away from the matter would be to place convenience above justice. That thought tasted bad. He asked then for facts, directness. "Who else knows?" Arnaldo's eyes flicked. "People. Some who trade coffee to the town, others who pass on the road, your neighbors perhaps. Mouth talk goes further than paper, and those who like a neat settlement will see it as useful." Rodrigo ordered an inventory. He told João Batista, the capataz he trusted, to meet him in the cellar. João was a man of practical certainties, less given to moralizing than to mechanics. When the three of them stood among the stacked sacks, the smell of roasted bean thick and warm, the scene felt small and ordinary enough to be household business. But in the space between sacks and sweeping broom, a decision was being made about what truth would be allowed to stand. They found discrepancies, sacks short in number. The stitching on a few seams altered as if to remove known marks that identified their origin. A ledger had entries that did not match the physical count. A neighbor's signature on a receipt that should have been routine bore the tremor that happens when a hand writes in haste. João's face hardened. He did not speak of motive, but pointed plainly to evidence. Rodrigo turned the facts over in his mind like coins. There was theft, yes, but there was also the foreman's bargain, the suggestion that a secret would be contained for a sum. He could pay men and bury the matter. He could unrig Arnaldo by offering him a quiet share and send him away with backhanded gratitude. Or he could act in a way that would disclose corruption and, with it, expose the household to gossip and possible reproach from neighbors and creditors who liked their reputations neat. The ledger of society was not the same as the moral ledger in his chest. One required maintaining applause, the other required making amends. He had been raised to weigh the first more often than the second. The note from Candida had shifted that scale toward discomfort. The idea that a woman who had nursed him might be reduced to a bargaining chip in the hands of a man like Arnaldo made his stomach knot with unfamiliar responsibility. He summoned Arnaldo then into the house's small parlor. The foreman stood as if expecting a gentle rebuke, perhaps a reprimand to be smoothed over. Rodrigo placed the evidence on the table. He told Arnaldo the facts plainly: missing coffee, forged receipts, a neighbor's ledger altered. Arnaldo's face did not betray the guilt that lay beneath the ledger's traces. Instead, he chose his approach like a man choosing a trade route. "If you do what is right, Baron," he said carefully, "people may be displeased. A man who disturbs the smooth can find himself without friends. Someone may puff a story to your neighbors. People will think less of your house. It is better to keep peace." Rodrigo felt the words as a test. Perhaps that was what Arnaldo expected. Perhaps this was the game the foreman had played his entire life. Rodrigo had never before been made the center of such a private threat. He had been cast previously as a steward of land and title. Now he was being asked to steward truth. He thought of Candida in the kitchen, of the way she had said she had been told to stay and to be quiet. He thought of his father purchasing, then releasing her, as if she were an instrument of household comfort to be put away when inconvenient. He thought of the whip hanging in the sunlight, and the small courage it took to stop it once. Rodrigo closed his hand on the paper in his pocket until the edges bit into his palm. He stood and walked to the window, looking out where the estate's boundary met the scrub and the first road to town. Delmiro Avala's manor sat across the valley, and its watchful occupant had a way of making public opinion into a private weapon. The neighbor would likely hear the rumor if given the right fuel. Reputation, Rodrigo knew, was fragile, and could be used to crush those who lacked the means to fight back. "What do you want?" he asked Arnaldo without turning. Arnaldo's face tightened. "A small payment," he said, naming a number that would have kept his pockets lined for a season. "Discretion costs money, you see. People prefer peace." Rodrigo felt himself make a choice in the quiet. He could send coin and silence the house like a mouth sewn closed. He could avert the storm and keep the ledger balanced. Or he could do something that would produce another kind of noise, the discomfort of truth aired, accusations made public, perhaps the loss of certain contracts with neighbors who shunned scandal. That course was untidy and might cost him socially and financially. His father's ledger voice was stronger in him when he imagined the alternative, when he imagined creditors frowning. His father's opinion had once been law in the house. To break it now would be to change the tenor of the estate in a manner he could not easily predict. Yet the note in his pocket felt like an accusation not just against the estate, but against a lifetime of conveniences he had accepted. Arnaldo, seeing no immediate weakness in Rodrigo's face, pushed. "If you do not wish to make this public, it is understood. Men will say what they want if there is profit in it. I can keep this quiet." Rodrigo turned to him then. He did not accuse loudly. He did not promise payment either. He asked a question that had the slowness of a hinge. "Did you steal the coffee yourself?" Arnaldo's upper lip twitched. There was a moment when guilt can be spoken in a cough or a denial. He chose an oblique answer. "I take steps to ensure the house keeps running," he said. "Sometimes that means moving things around when the books do not match the work. People understand, people make allowances." That was in itself an admission. The house was not a machine in perfect repair. It was a human apparatus where leverage translated into small economies. Arnaldo's suggestion that one could simply move things around to make the estate hum was a confession not of criminality alone, but of a moral permissiveness that had kept the household's operations in place for years. Rodrigo left the parlor and walked back toward the kitchen. The day leaned toward evening. Voices rose in the yard like the beginning of a storm. Men came and went, with bits of gossip strapped in the folds of their shirts. He thought of the man on the ground earlier, the almost lashed figure, and how close a life could come to being defined by the moment another man chose to inflict pain. He thought of Candida, and the plainness of her letter, and how small things, an envelope, a clove, a folded page, could unmake a house's complacency. He wanted to do what was right. He also understood that right did not dissolve the years of injury. He could not, with a stroke of pen, repay the life a woman had given in nursing him, nor could he return to her the things she had lost to being sold and bought and returned. He also knew that a private act now could be meaningful in lessening the estate's claim over that life. There was the notary in town, a man whose ink could make a thing legal and visible in a way that would thwart those who traded in secrets. There was also the simpler, more immediate thing, to protect Candida from further humiliation, to ensure she had decent food and a place to rest, to see a doctor if she required it. He sat for a while on the back step and breathed. The smell of wood smoke met the clove in his nose, and for a moment all the motes of the past swam into visibility. He thought of the house as a machine of choices, small choices that, over years, had formed the reality of many lives. He also felt a new, stranger thing, the obligation that named itself not by inheritance but by conscience. When he rose that afternoon, it was with a thin, hardening resolve. He would not be the man who paid to maintain convenient silences. If Arnaldo had been stealing, that theft must be accounted for. If Arnaldo sought to profit by bargaining away the dignity of a woman who had given him his infancy, then that man must be unmoored of his power. But he also understood the consequences. Removing a fighter who had held so much sway could cause ripples beyond the yard walls. Neighbors might rail. The local merchant might withdraw credit. His social weight could be tested. He sent Juan Batista to the town the next morning with an instruction to fetch the notary if need be, and to bring a physician should one be required. He told Juan to be discreet, but firm. Count the coffee, find the receipts, trace the signatures. Rodrigo himself asked Benedito to sit with Candida that evening and keep watch. He wanted others to know that Candida would be attended to, not as a spectacle but as a human being. That night the house felt altered. Lamps seemed to burn with an intentional steadiness. Gossip would find its way into the marketplace in due course. Men would judge. The neighbor, Coronel Del Miro, who prided himself on keeping a rhetorical ledger of morality, might already be readying a sermon of scolding. But inside the Mendonça house, amid the low noises of sutured days, a different current had started. Candida did not sleep by the hearth that night. She sat by the window, hands folded, and watched the road. The moon made silver trails across the path. The house exhaled and drew its breath again. She had written the letter not as a trap, but as a bridge. She had endured for the reasons she had named, to see whether the boy, the man he had become, would claim what was owed. That was a kind of patience some would misread as submission. It was not. It had been for her a strategy. Rodrigo stood by the window opposite her and did not speak. His interior was not cleansed by the act of not speaking. Rather, it was occupied by the slow assembly of responsibility. He had stopped a whip that day. He had received a letter the next morning that changed what he could not unknow. The solutions offered by convenience were laid before him like coins. He had refused to take all of them at face value. Now, something harder and less tidy waited. Outside, a dog barked once, then was quiet. Overhead, the stars kept their ancient order. Inside the house, small objects carried more weight than they had the day before. A clove floating in the next morning's coffee, a folded sheet of paper on the desk, a ledger with names etched into its margins. These things, once trivial, had become the carriers of history. Rodrigo knew he would have to choose. The choice would make enemies, and it would not rebuild the years Candida had lost. It would, however, alter the trajectory of the present. He had to decide whether he would preserve reputation over truth or truth over reputation. He had to decide whether he would treat Candida the way the house had always treated those closest to its needs, or whether he would, in some concrete, public way, make amends. He asked Juan to bring him the foreman's ledger the next morning. When the document lay on the desk, with its ink grown pale in places and fresh in others, Rodrigo felt the weight of the decision again. The number Arnaldo had proposed the day before, his price for silence, circulated now through Rodrigo's mind like a coin tossed and examined from all sides. He thought of his father's face when dealing with creditors, and the way convenience had often been preferred to courage. He thought of Candida's hands, the lines of service traced in their palms. He was not naive. He knew that any action he took would not mend the years of injury. He knew also that in a province like Serafria, the consequences of disrupting certain balances could be immediate and sharp. Yet after the letter, after Benedito's confirmation, after the taste of clove had become the compass that guided this memory, Rodrigo felt the curvature of his life tilt in the direction of a different sort of stewardship. At dawn, before the house rose in its full household rhythm, he walked the perimeter of the land. He held his father's ledger in his hand, not to add to it, but to read it for the omissions. He noticed for the first time the notches on the plinth of the well where names had been carved in quick grief. He saw the small cross at the edge of the orchard, marking a grave he had never visited. The past was a field dotted with small, neglected monuments. When he returned, Arnaldo was waiting at the stairhead, hands folded behind his back as if the foreman had made himself a figure of patient fortitude. "Have you decided?" he asked. Rodrigo looked at him and saw finally what the foreman had been for his lifetime. An engine for smoothing the estate's reputation, a man who turned truth into a commodity. "We will account for what has been taken," Rodrigo said. His voice carried the way a measured sentence carries on an even road. "We will not pay to silence a truth. If there are receipts forged, they will be presented. If there is theft, the estate will seek restitution. And if a man beneath my roof uses another's misfortune for his profit, I will relieve him of his station." Arnaldo's face tightened, and for a breath there was an expression that might have been fury, or might have been fear. "That will make trouble," he said. "People do not like the accounts opened." "Accounts must be opened," Rodrigo replied. "The question we decide now is whether we will be counted among those who fix their robes to appear unsoiled, while the hands that served them remain scarred." Arnaldo left the estate not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of a door. The small mechanisms he controlled would resist. They would find friends. Creditors and neighbors would mention the household and its sudden thirst for righteousness in the market and the taverns. The news of Rodrigo's stance would be a small bruise to their assumptions. But when he turned back to the kitchen, Candida was there, tending a pot and lifting her face. She did not ask what had been decided. She waited, the way someone who had survived on attention knows to do. Rodrigo sat across from her and placed both his hands on the table, the way one sometimes does when choosing to make a promise, not of words, but of continued action. "Candida," he said, "I cannot erase what was done, but I will not hide it." She looked at him, and in her look was a patience uncolored by triumph. "You do what you must," she said. "I did what I could." Outside, the land held its breath. Men in the valley would speak and trade their opinions. People who traded in the currency of rumor would set measures and begin to count. The notary's office in the town would open in the morning. This was how small revolutions began in a province. With a card laid on a table, with a man who chose to break a habit, with a woman who had written a name on a folded paper so the truth could not be entirely buried. Rodrigo poured himself a cup of coffee. He dropped one clove into it and watched the brown surface tremble. The clove floated and turned, as if orbiting the very small private gravity of that moment. He tasted it, and for the first time understood why that particular spice had been threaded into his memory. It was a bridge between a child's consolation and an adult's reckoning. He could not know how the news would travel. He could not know whether his houses of credit would flinch or firm up in the face of scandal. He could not know whether those who trafficked in comfort and silence would move their trade elsewhere. He could know, however, that a series of choices had begun and could be counted upon as a chain. The stopping of the whip, the appearance of the letter, the confession of theft, the making of the choice not to hush the matter. Each link altered the next. As the sun dipped behind the Serafria ridgeline, the house settled into... When the sun rose the next morning, it found the house awake in a different key. Men moved with the cautious economy of those who had learned a small storm was passing through the roof. Women at the hearth kept their hands in the work that made the day possible. Rodrigo walked the rooms with the quiet of a man assembling a plan. He did not speak loudly. He did not make promises that would become theatre. He set into motion what could be done with ink and witness, and the stubbornness of someone deciding to answer a summons. He sent João Batista to the town with a clear instruction: fetch the notary if necessary, the doctor if needed, count the sacks in the cellar and bring back anyone who might testify to receipts. João nodded and left with the steadiness of a man who knew the routes between farms and market stalls, where nobody spoke in the language of absolution, but everyone kept records in the language of need. Rodrigo asked Benedito to sit with Candida that day, not as a concession but as a deliberate signal. She would not be left to the predatory curiosities of the yard. Benedito accepted, and when he passed into the kitchen, Candida's hands folded for a moment, as if in recognition of an old treaty keeping pace. The two elders conversed in the low grammar of those who bore memory. Their talk was less about sorrow than about arrangement, where a blanket should be placed, which herbs might ease a cough, what small errands should be done to keep the household from unraveling into scandal. Before João returned, Rodrigo summoned Arnaldo into the parlor and placed the ledger and the handful of suspicious receipts on the table. The foreman's face was a study in carefully distributed assurance. He had expected, perhaps, to negotiate the price of silence and walk away with a pocket lined for the season. He had not expected the Baron to hold evidence rather than coins. "I will not hush a truth with money," Rodrigo said. He allowed the sentence to be simple, neither grand nor petty. It was a decision worn like a servant's shirt, practical, plain, unavoidable. Arnaldo's jaw hardened. "You make enemies with such gestures, Baron," he said. "Men in town will make talk. Those who hold your credit will think you a man who courts trouble." "Let them talk," Rodrigo answered. "If a man steals from his house, he must answer. If a man uses the house's shame as a currency, he will find no favor here." Arnaldo chose that breathing hole where propriety allows one to say a threat without naming it. "You place a lot of weight on one woman's letter. She could say more, she could tell many things. Discretion can be bought." Rodrigo slid a small stack of wrinkled invoices and the neighbor's ledger toward the foreman. "Return what you can," he said. "If you cannot, you will account for it where men can see. I will relieve you of your duties." That day the house's hush lifted into action. João came back with the notary's clerk and an issuing physician at the edges. The town moved like a tide in and out of a province's needs, and an inventory was made. The smell of the seller's coffee rose up as sacks were counted and unstitched. The warm bean odor mixed with the ever-present note of wood smoke and the thin persistence of clove that hung like a memory in a cup. In places there were holes, seams resewn and marks where the house's brand had been cut away. The neighbor's receipt bore a signature written in haste. The numbers did not match the physical count. It was enough to show that the pattern of small thefts had been real, not imagination. When Rodrigo confronted Arnaldo with the facts, the foreman's composure frayed. He tried to make the ledger a conversation about the house's greater needs, about men whose families required coin, about allowances in hard seasons. When faced with the paper trace of his own practice, the defenses that reason would have offered him appeared thin. "So you will leave," Rodrigo said at last. "You will take what you have and go. If there is repayment, we will seek it, but you will no longer hold sway in this house." Arnaldo's departure was not theatrical. He left with his boots on, the creak of the stair beneath him a small punctuation. He took little of his dignity with him. He left with the small heat of someone betrayed by a sudden absence of complicity. The yard watched him go, and true to the social economy of the valley, people made measures. Some offered condolences to a man who had lost his station. Others nodded at the maintenance of order. News did not require time to travel. Those who had ears in the right places already had enough to trade, but the manner of its arrival could be shaped by the Baron's choice. Rodrigo had chosen to make the shape of that news accountability rather than hush. Not everyone approved. Word reached Coronel Delmiro Avelar that afternoon. He sent a careful note requesting a visit. Delmiro came in the kind of carriage that announced the precision of a man's public sense. He sat with the measured courtesy of a neighbor who keeps his ledger of judgments in good order. "You have stirred the pot, Rodrigo," Delmiro said, leaning forward in the parlor, his palms open in the way of a man who places his opinion before the world like a platter. "There are lines one does not like crossed. A household must appear solid." Rodrigo met him without the flutter of a man seeking to catch favor. "A household that is solid on faces alone will rot within," he said. If a man steals, he must account. If a woman has been reduced to silence, the house cannot pretend that silence is harmless. Delmiro's brows knit. He spoke not as a judge, but as a man who measured reputations the way a merchant weighs coffee sacks. "Reputation's a trade," he said. "You risk credit, Rodrigo. Men prefer houses that are quiet. Quiet buys trust." "What does the house owe the people it used?" Rodrigo asked. "Does it owe them the comfort of being kept as quiet things when the world has wronged them?" Delmiro's answer was not a moral one. "It owes them continuity," he said. "It owes the market the least amount of scandal." Rodrigo left the exchange with the sense that he had stepped into a fissure between two economies, one of public nicety and one of private reckoning. He understood the cost that might come, the withdrawal of favors, the tightening of trade lines, but he also understood the cost of quiet, the further impoverishment of those whose lives had been appropriated into the smooth operations of an estate. That evening, Candida sat by the hearth with a hot cloth at her knees. She ate slowly, as women do who have learned the art of conserving strength. The day's events had not made her triumphant. She had not sought restitution as a way to dramatize her life. She had sought only to be seen, to be named, to press a truth into the world before the body that carried it could no longer stand. She watched the house with a practical light, as if cataloguing what would need to be done in the coming months. Rodrigo went to Benedito and asked quietly if the old man thought Candida was well enough to attend to the formalities the next day. Benedito shook his head, the way one shakes dust from a coat. "She is not a young woman," he said, "but she is not fragile in the way you imagine. She knows how to walk through seasons. Still, a doctor will do no harm." They sent for Dr. Americo Saldana, a local physician whose practice moved between towns like a steady hand. He arrived with a small satchel and the careful attention of someone trained to read a body slowly. He examined Candida with the professional tenderness of a man who understood the limits of his art. "She needs rest," he said, "better food, a warm bed. There are old aches and a cough that will not be hurried. If the house will supply what I prescribe, she will have better seasons." Rodrigo insisted on what the doctor recommended. He saw to new linens, meat on a plate more often, a bed near the hearth so she would not have to walk far in the night. He did not make a show of it. He arranged the care as quietly as one might lay a plank over a gap in a floor. The difference was not in public spectacle. It was in a daily steadying of small things that add up into a life with fewer indignities. The notary, when he arrived in town and when Rodrigo later went with Benedito to his office, was a man with ink on his fingers and an attitude for the formalities of property and paper. Rodrigo asked that the work be done simply, without fanfare, and with witnesses who understood the gravity of a name written and a paper sealed. "You will make it legal?" Candida asked when he told her of his intent. She did not say the word free with the dramatic inflection of someone crossing a prize. She used quiet words. "To sign something will not put back the years. It will perhaps mean that no man can sell me again." Rodrigo held the small folded paper he had kept in his pocket since the morning he found it. The paper felt like the weight of a question. He had thought of manumission as a bureaucratic instrument, the notary's ink making graphic what should have been obvious in human terms. He also knew that ink could matter in the world where documents opened doors and closed mouths. At the notary's table, he signed where the man indicated, his name written without title, the rhythm of the pen deliberate. The document declared, in the language of momentary clarity, that Candida's status as a slave of the estate was to be ended by his hand. The act was private. There were only Benedito and João as witnesses, and the notary's clerk to make the rub of ink permanent. Rodrigo did not call the town to come. He did not demand applause. He did not want the gesture turned into a spectacle that might re-instrumentalize Candida's life into a token of his own virtue. When he returned with the folded official paper, he placed it on the table before Candida and sat down opposite her in the kitchen where they had first spoken. The light at the window made her hair look like dusk's own edge. Rodrigo watched her as she unfolded the sheet with hands that had known the practice of carefulness for years. She read it slowly. She paused at the formal words and then at his name. When she looked up, there was no triumph in her face, no triumph in the acceptance of the paper. There was instead a small, private recognition. "Rodrigo," she said, and the saying of his name without the title loosened something in him more than any public recognition could have. She folded the paper and placed it into a small wooden box she kept with the kitchen's other small valuables. "It will keep someone from doing the thing that was done to me. Thank you." Her thanks was not a coronation. It was human and ordinary and final in its own way. She knew the limits of what a piece of paper could do. She knew, too, that a signature did not mend the nights she had been sold, the rents in the cloth of her life, the names that had been written into ledgers instead of remembered with tenderness. But she also knew that it made a practical difference. She could not be sold again. The estate would be publicly bound by a record. In the months that followed, seasons folded into one another with the patient regularity of small domestic miracles. Candida spent afternoons in the orchard, putting seeds in the soil, as if sowing small, sure consolations into the earth. She began to visit the town in company with Benedito for market errands, sitting by the stall with the steady comfort of a woman who had learned where to find the best oranges and a gossip that did not belong to a master. Friends of the household, women who had once behaved as if she were invisible, began slowly and sometimes awkwardly to call on her with pies and small talk. Some gestures were clumsy, others were simply ordinary kindness. She accepted nothing that felt like indulgence and took what she needed with the reserve of someone who had worked out how to live on the terms life permitted. Rodrigo felt the change as a series of small talks inside him. He did not wake convinced he was absolved. He woke conscious of a record that could not be turned back into ledger entries. He found himself with a new compulsion, to ensure that the estate would hold a standard that was not only the imitation of honor. He ordered changes in some contracts. He refused to patronize certain traders who had been glad to profit from a household silence. Men criticized him for making trouble where there had been none, and others said he had done the right if late thing. His social position took on a different color, a bitter sweetness that felt like weather. Coronel Delmiro watched from across his valley with a disapproving set to his mouth and made his displeasure known to those whose opinions mattered in the market. A merchant withdrew a line of credit when the gossip reached his ledgers. A small buyer sought another supplier. Money, like rumor, moves in its own economy. Rodrigo felt the tug. Business acquaintances changed their tone when they addressed him. The grace given to a household secure in old alliances cooled into a critical air. But not everything shifted away. Some stayed. There were neighbors who admired in private a courage they would not have had themselves. There were clients who respected a man who took what he owed seriously, if belatedly. The estate did not collapse into ruin. Instead, it rearranged the distribution of favor. The house's public face struck new lines of relation. Arnaldo, after his dismissal, became a kind of warning left to wander. He went to other houses seeking sympathy or employment, and with a readiness to sharpen rumor into armor. He found work, but his authority was bruised, and many men who had been comfortable under his arrangement learned to weigh their own complicities. Rodrigo neither gloated nor harried him into ruin. That would have been another form of spectacle. Rodrigo's decision had been to stop enabling the practice, not to transform himself into a vengeance instrument. He let accountability do its work visibly and let the social consequences ride their course. Candida's health, for all the doctor's steadiness, moved in a slow arc toward finality. Her cough would come in long seasons and then recede with care and food and sleep. She had small triumphs, a harvest eaten with friends, a day at the town where she purchased a blue ribbon that pleased her enough to keep. She did not speak often of the past unless asked. When she did, she spoke of it plainly. Sales, purchases, the noise of markets, the night's quiet, when she had sat with a child's fever. Years measured in simple changes became 4. 4 winters and 4 summers wound themselves around the estate. Rodrigo would sit with her on an evening now and then, and they would speak as two people who had negotiated the unglamorous business of making amends. He asked her practical things, what she wanted in terms of her small domestic comfort, the book she liked to borrow. She asked of him small human things, to mend a bench in the garden so her knees might not be taxed. The paper of the manumission lay in her wooden box beneath a cloth and was taken out sometimes to be glanced at, like a map to a small freedom. When her end neared, The counts of gratitude and guilt gathered in a complicity that had neither redemption nor pardon. She told Rodrigo nothing came entirely right. No signature made the past non-existent. That was a truth she carried like a shawl. She told him instead what she wanted. A simple interment when the time came. A wooden cross on the ground so that a name would stand with letters that spelled her correctly, without the slurs or diminutions the ledger had once entertained. She requested the right to have Benedito lead the prayers at the grave. These were small things, and for someone who had been reduced to items, they were substantial. Rodrigo listened and took these wishes as commands. He had learned that service can be ritualized into sincerity only if it meets the particular requests of those who have been injured. He could not, with any honest claim, make restitution for decades of wrong, but he could, with a deliberate and patient set of acts, give the dignity of attention. When the day arrived, it was neither melodramatic nor clean. The house had its small, attentive crowd, João and his family, Benedito with his cane, Dr. Americo with his quiet, professional grace. A few neighbors came, some with awkward faces, some with the steady gaze of people who had watched the house change and accepted it with their own slow accommodations. Coronel Del Miro did not attend. Those who stained applause with private judgment often keep a distance when things get quiet. The town watchers were not with them. This was not a parade. It was a brief, solemn and honest closing. Candida lay with a blanket pulled up to her chest. Rodrigo sat at the edge of the bed and held her hand. His later life had come to be measured in what he kept close and what he could not buy back. She looked at him and then at the window where the last light sipped slowly from the ridgeline. The smell of wood and the residue of clove rose in the room like a remembered hymn. "Rodrigo," she said, and the way she spoke his name made the long years stand upright for a moment. "You did what you could." He felt the complexity of those words as if they were a weight and a gift. "Not enough," he began, and then stopped because the truth of his insufficiency was another kind of knowledge she already carried. "No," she said, not sharply but like a person settling a small account. "Not enough for the years. Enough for now." Those were the last words she gave that were meant for the living to hold as instruction. She breathed, and then grew quiet in the way a lamp that runs out of oil does, a soft, diminishing glow. When her breath left, it left a room that smelled of the ordinary things she had loved. Rodrigo sat for a long time after Benedito read prayers. He felt a sorrow that was not clean-up for guilt, but rather the full measure of a life allowed to be measured. He took the wooden plank that he had bought in a town where the carpenter made things like small consolations and carved there with fingers that had earlier signed a legal paper and now did something very human, a name. The cross he made was simple and unadorned. He spelled Candida exactly, the way she had longed. The letters were steady, not flourish. He pressed into the wood nothing of grand metaphor. He pressed into it the literalness of a name. He placed it at the grave's head in the orchard where she had liked to sit. They lowered her into the earth with hands that had tended and loved her in different ways, with Benedito leading their words. No trumpet sounded, no crowd cheered. There was only the small humility of the soil and the work of burying someone whose life had been counted by many small tasks. After the funeral, Rodrigo returned to his rooms and to the ledger he had inherited. The ledger's pages were not magic. They did not wash away what had been done. At night, when the house was stilled, he would sometimes take up the small wooden box that contained Candida's manumission and read the lines as if the ink's presence could do more than ink usually does. He found that the presence of her name in the house's record and its placement in the world made some things more honest. Servants were treated with a modicum more dignity. A few traders respected different rules. A foreman learned the dangers of turning human need into profit, but he also learned there was always more to be done. There were years of effects that his gesture could not touch. When people asked him later whether the act of manumitting Candida had changed him entirely, he would not claim purity. He had lost some favor with men like Del Miro, and money that had been convenient in the past came with more scrutiny. He had gained something else interior and not easily traded, a measure of disquiet that kept him watching himself in ways he had not before. He accepted he would always be in debt to the life she had given him as a child, and in the debt he lived differently. He taught himself to name things plainly when he could, to refuse the small economic lies that lubricate convenience, and to ensure those in the house had an ability to speak without fear. Benedito lived on as the keeper of more than memory. He became, in the household's quiet, a public translator of a private ledger into human narrative. He would, in the years that followed, tell the children of the house the parts of life that had not been written into property records, the nights of vigil, the songs hummed in the kitchen, the way hands can hold another's fever until dawn. He told these things without invention, with the plain respect of someone who knows the difference between overwriting a person and remembering them. As seasons rolled, the clove in the cup remained a small ritual in the Mendonça house. Sometimes Rodrigo would taste it and remember the sound of a whip paused in mid-air, the folded paper on the desk, Candida's name. The clove did not absolve. It acted as a bridge between the comfort of a child's memory and the discreet, often painful labor of attending to a life one had wronged. He never pretended the manumission erased years. He did not make the signature into a coat of absolution. He recognized publicly that the gesture was, at best, an attempt to stop the household from perpetuating further injury. He tried to make sure the next generation of workers would have fewer of the indignities his household had practiced. That was a work of steadying, not of triumphant closure. There were costs. Some business withdrew, some neighbors kept their distance, and the household's social map had new margins. Rodrigo accepted these as part of the ledger he had chosen. He had chosen a kind of integrity that refused the currency of silence. He had also accepted that he would never be able to write back into the years what had been taken. The balance was not perfection. It was the attempt. In the quiet months he would walk to the orchard and stand by Candida's cross. He would run his hand along the carved letters and say her name under his breath. Sometimes he spoke aloud the small truths he had avoided in his life. The times he had not asked, the assumptions he had taken for granted, the years he had allowed other people to make choices that affected others' fates. Saying the words did not do penance. It kept him honest. The question that settled over the house and through it, over Rodrigo's later years, was one that mattered less as theory and more as practice. Does late reparation still matter? The question was not posed as a neat philosophical puzzle. It arrived as a daily occupation, the difference between a woman dying unheard and a woman being named, the difference between a house that hides its shame and a house that admits it and tries to alter its ways. Reparation could not make the years of suffering go away, but it could, in some small and stubborn ways, alter the life that followed. When people in the town argued the point, they did so like men who were measuring the weight of an act, without always understanding how it felt to be on the receiving end of it. Some said late gestures were vanity, others said they were at least better than silence. Those who had lived inside the house's economy, servants, neighbors, and those whose fortunes touched the Mendonça estate, found their own answers by living out the consequences. For Candida, the manumission was a practical barrier against being sold again, and the dignity of being named at her death mattered. For Rodrigo, the act changed him into someone who, however imperfectly, counted the cost of things and felt the ache of that accounting in his chest. Years later, sitting alone in the office that smelled of lemon oil and paper, Rodrigo would sometimes open the drawer where he had kept Candida's note and the small wooden box with the manumission. He would lay them down and trace with his finger the lines of ink, the letters steadied by a notary's stamp. He would think how odd it was that paper could be both a small and a potent thing. It gave her a legal boundary, a protection. It reminded him of the debt he could not entirely pay. That debt remained a guiding discomfort. It was not a dramatic conversion that absolved him of his family's past. It was a slow accretion of daily choices and an acceptance of the cost those choices could bring. In the end, the men who had kept the ledger of convenience had to reckon with the fact that a woman's name, written plainly and spelled correctly on an unadorned wooden cross, could refocus attention on how things had been done. It did not erase the harm. It did make the house different. As for Candida, the orchard where she rests was tended in the way of those who love a person, by keeping the ground under their feet in order. The cross remained small and honest, the letters holding the truth of a life. Benedito tended the mound when seasons demanded, and João with his family sometimes left flowers. The clove floated in the cups of coffee as if to say, memory must be tasted, and that the act of tasting is the act of attending. There are things a signature cannot do. There are pains no paper can simply remove. But there are also acts that, when done late, still tilt the present toward justice in the small ways that matter. Stopping a whip in mid-air, refusing a bargain that would have traded a woman's truth for silence, inscribing a name exactly as it should be. These acts do not cancel the ledger of injury, but they begin, in their small and stubborn fashion, to rebalance it. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more narratives that trace the quiet, complicated edges of human lives and the slow work of making amends. When the day closes over Serafria and the wooden houses throw cool shadows into the yard, the question lingers in the air like the scent of clove. Does late reparation still matter? It matters for those who survive it, not because it makes the past disappear, but because it makes the future, however short or long, measure up differently. The price of saying a truth at last is not the wiping away of harm. It is the recognition of it, and the willingness to let that recognition shape how one lives from that moment on. Tell us, what do you think? When the time comes to repair a wrong that has been decades in the making, can a late act of justice change the life that follows? Share your thoughts below.